Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
Sheila Gunn Reid for Rebel News, and I'm bringing you an afternoon update in day 2 of a 3-day federal court hearing challenging Justin Trudeau's illegal and unconstitutional COVID jail system. Rebel News lawyers, right now, they're currently in court fighting to strike down the regulations that caused our former journalist Keean Bexte to be first subjected to an involuntary 72-hour airport incarceration, awaiting the result of a second clear COVID test, before then being forced to quarantine at home for 14 more days while perfectly healthy. Now, we learned this morning that the COVID jail sentence of 3 days plus thousands of dollars in costs, plus the subsequent 14-day quarantine at home, only applies to healthy people. People exhibiting signs of COVID-19 leave the airport and then they go straight home to quarantine. No COVID jail hell for them. Day 1, lawyers for Rebel News and the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms made their cases. You can see all of my coverage and support our ongoing lawsuit at nocovidjails.com. This morning, Jeffrey Rath, a lawyer for a BC-based businessman, made his case against the COVID jails. And you can see that coverage from earlier at nocovidjails.com. This afternoon, lawyers for the government were arguing in favor of the COVID jail system as a means to stop the so-called variants of concern from entering into the country. The federal government has 5 lawyers across 3 jurisdictions fighting our lawyers in court. Charlene Tellis-Langdon opened her arguments on behalf of the government by asking, first, the Chief Justice to not consider whether Rebel News even has standing to challenge the constitutionality of the quarantine regulations at all. Lawyers for the government also admitted that Rebel News lawyers from JSS barristers Sarah Miller and Robert Hawks filed the most complete records of documents and affidavits, and the government is relying on all of our documents for their case. It's important to note once again that the government does not dispute any of our Rebel News affidavits or our evidence, because the government declined to cross-examine Ezra Levant and Keean Bexte on their sworn evidence. Now, today the government did a fair bit of what I would describe as necromancing, that almost religious recitation of COVID death statistics as justification for lockdowns and quarantines. Government lawyers also argued that there is a significant amount of spread of COVID-19 from asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic people, and this justifies the COVID jails. But as noted this morning, the government hasn't produced any evidence of asymptomatic spread relating specifically to Canada. And as noted yesterday, there is no evidence that variants of concern came in on airplanes. However, the government spent a good portion of the day again explaining that many air travelers are arriving from hot zones of these variants of concern, citing the fact that air travelers subsequently tested positive for variants of concern after their arrival. But upon questioning from Chief Justice Crampton about whether the government knew where the exposure of the variants actually came from, government lawyers were forced to admit that they cannot know that beyond a reasonable doubt. The implication here being that the variants of concern could be coming in from the United States on ground travelers who are not subject to the COVID jails and then being transferred to the regular population after the fact, including these air travelers. We close the day with the feds arguing that they don't actually run their own COVID jails, but rather the government contracts with the COVID jail hotels for their services, then forces the citizens to go to a COVID jail under threat of even more jail time. And the government creates the restrictions inside the COVID jails, and then the government also decides when the citizens get to leave a COVID jail. You have to ask yourself, why is the government so passionately defending these unconstitutional restrictions if they really do intend to scrap these COVID jails in short order? Now, that's why it's so important that we challenge the COVID jail system, because it would seem that the government has no intention of getting rid of these things willingly. I'll be back in court tomorrow when the federal government intends to take the morning to continue their arguments to keep this COVID jail system in place. If you'd like to support our lawsuit against the illegal and unconstitutional confinement of perfectly healthy Canadians for 72 hours for the crime of just trying to come home to their own country, please donate today at nocovidjails.com. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn-Reid. If you'd like to support our lawsuit against Justin Trudeau's illegal and unconstitutional COVID jail system, where perfectly healthy, law-abiding Canadian citizens are taken against their will and confined in a COVID jail, and then are handed the bill for their own confinement, please go to nocovidjails.com.